ETSA webinar. Today, our topic is the Sibling Subsystem in families with a child with Down syndrome, processes and outcomes. Today, our webinar will be translated in few languages, like we usually have. Today, we have a Turkish, German, French, Czech, Croatian, Italian, and Ukrainian. Today, we have a little bit different situation. Our speaker, Professor Monica Kelly, she's not with us today as she's living in Australia. And we are so pleased that she had this talk on one event for International Day of Person with Down Syndrome on 21st of March. And in UK, in Down Syndrome Education International, we organized one big event for the researcher. And Professor Monica Kelly, she participated there. We asked and got from Down Syndrome Education International this recording. And today we will give you this record, and which is in English, and our translators will translate in languages that we say. Who is Monica Kelly? Just few information about her, because she will not be with us and she will not have a possibility to say more about her. Professor Monica Kelly is a professor and research director of the Applied Research Center of Disability and Wellbeing, a joint initiative of the University of Tasmania, and Possibility Group, a service organization working with the people with disability. Prior to joining the University of Tasmania, she had been at the University of Queensland, where she was director of Down Syndrome Research Program from 2003 to 2016. Her PhD focus was on the siblings of children with Down syndrome, which has remained an area of continuing her interest. She has also studied the development of individuals with Down syndrome, including cognitive and language development, motivation, and self-regulation. Recently, she has investigated the impact of siblings on the development of children with autism, a study which is going on. She's also conducting work in the area of long lines of people with intellectual disability. She's a fellow of the Academy of Social Science in Australia. We have a few tips, a few things for you. And please, Emin, could you give me another slide? Thank you very much. Here's information on which languages we have a translation today, with short comments where you could find your translation. If you look down on the bottom of your screen, you will see one globe. That is mentioned also down interpretation. Please go and click there and choose the language which you would like to hear. And then translation will go on that channel. Just few things before our webinar. Our meeting is being recorded and live broadcast on the Facebook, on YouTube, and we will use that also on ETSA website. The records will be shared on the social media accounts on ETSA all. The webinar is not for diagnosis and treatment. The context of the webinar reflects the view only of authors, and the ETSA cannot be held responsible for any use which may be made of the information containing therein. If you want to watch our previous webinars, please search as the ETSA channel on YouTube and subscribe it. But if you would like to put any question, today, like I said, it will be a little bit different situation than our previous webinars, because our speaker is not today with us. But if you put some question, we will organize that question, give some answers by Professor Monica. You could see also on the bottom of your screen this sign for the messages, like asking question and the comments. There you could put your question and we will be pleased to answer. Please follow us on social media that we have for ETSA, but we could say the main, you start with our ETSA website and then use other channel as well.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session. And thank you, Sue and the team, for inviting me to present to you today. So as is customary now, I'd like to acknowledge the Palawa and Gadigal people who've been the custodians of the lands from which I'm presenting for thousands of years. I pay my respects to their elders and extend those respects to the elders of other nations who are attending this conference. So I thought I'd give you kind of an overview of what I hope to cover today. So I'm going to start off with some general guff that kind of sets the scene for my thinking about siblings and the sibling subsystem in families that have a child with Down syndrome. I will then talk about the outcomes for siblings of children with Down syndrome. I want to, though, spend quite a bit of the time really speculating about the sibling subsystem and the ways in which the subsystem might work in families that have a child with a disability and with Down syndrome in particular, and the areas in which these the sibling may have influence. And I'm going to end my presentation with some recommendations for research and conclusions. So siblings as a whole are under-researched in all family research. And that includes those in which there are families in which there's a child with a developmental disability. I should just draw your attention to the kind of the awkwardness of using the term sibling, because of course, I'm going to be talking about siblings of individuals with Down syndrome, and those individuals, of course, are also themselves siblings. And I do want to talk about that, the reciprocal relationship between siblings when one of the members has Down syndrome. But primarily, when I speak of siblings, I'm talking about the children in the family who do not have Down syndrome, and I will often talk about the person with Down syndrome. If I make an error in this and it doesn't make sense to you then, please put a question in the chat and I'll try and clear up whatever confusion I have caused by my misspeaking. So almost all of the research on siblings in families that have a child with Down syndrome are reporting on the children who do not have Down syndrome or the adults who do not have Down syndrome in the sibling relationship. There's very little that's focused on the siblingness or the outcomes for people with Down syndrome of having siblings, which has been really an extraordinary oversight on the part of researchers. So a lot of what I'll be talking about today then will be speculative because there really isn't the literature to draw on. There's no firm evidence for a lot of what I'm talking about, but I've looked at the literature related to typically developing siblings and tried to apply that to the research that we would be doing and should be thinking about with respect to individuals with Down syndrome and their siblings. Okay, so on to some of the general guff now. And for some people, this is just teaching people to suck eggs, but I just want to remind everybody that siblings are part of a family, and families will contribute to the ways in which siblings influence and are influenced by each other and the way that they interact and so on. But families are not all the same and haven't always been the same. So the definition of who is included in a family has changed over the ages, and it differs among cultures. And even the idea of who is a sibling is also not a fixed idea. So at one point in time, siblings would have been assumed to be biological siblings, all living with the same parents under the same roof, whereas now that may not be the case. Siblings may be half siblings, step siblings. They may live some of the time together and some of the time apart. So who actually constitutes the sibling subsystem within a family is not a fixed idea, but neither culture and the way that culture influences family, and so the differences amongst families that are due to cultural differences, and this idea of who actually constitutes the sibling subsystem is often not considered in the research. It's certainly not often discussed. And so there's very little that tells us about some of these aspects. And so there's a caution here that in most of the research is going to come from the West that I'm going to be talking about today. It may not be applicable in other cultures where family expectations, responsibilities differ. And so professionals, parents, researchers from those countries may want to think very carefully about whether or not they adopt the ideas that are current in the literature about siblings. So families are systems, and they comprise multiple subsystems. And if you look at this system here, imagine it as a kind of a rolling ball, sort of, so that all of the systems are rolling within this larger system as the members of the systems age and change. So siblings are going to get older, and that's going to bring changes both to the individual in terms of their development and to the way in which they interact. Parents are going to get older, and that will change the way that they interact and the way that they interact with the children in their system. So there's a very great deal of complexity within this whole family system. And of course, when we think about sibling subsystems, there may be multiple subsystems within that subsystem if there are multiple siblings, not just two siblings. And both outcomes and processes may differ if there are more than two children in the sibling subsystems. Families that have a larger number of siblings face additional challenges, but also may have additional resources to them that will impact on the developmental outcomes of children in the way that the siblings influence each other. So these kinds of complexities of these multiple systems interacting with each other and moving as everybody ages and changes contribute to the uncertainties that are associated with understanding sibling outcomes and the processes that are associated with them. So the family system, of course, also is in a broader system that is also likely to change. So the family lives within the local community, and they may differ depending on the inclusiveness of the community, opportunities and services that they offer. And that local community then is within a society, and that society will have attitudes, policies, expectations of families, and so on. And these things, of course, are also likely to change with time. So as well as the time related to the age and developmental stage of the family members, there's also time related to social change. For example, there are changes in longevity, both of people with disabilities and with their parents. So both people with disabilities with Down syndrome and their parents are living to be older. Families and the attitudes of society are going to differ depending on cultural attitudes, and families and siblings are going to generally reflect those cultural attitudes towards disability. There may be increases, so cultural issues might increase expectations, responsibilities, and so on. Changes in society might be occur with opportunities with respect to education and employment. And for example, with the introduction of the NDIS in Australia, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which I imagine many of you know about, but that's a new insurance scheme that was introduced into Australia in 2016, which was intended to provide equitable funding for people with all kinds of disabilities to help them, well, to ensure them that they lived a good quality life. But that's brought with it, as well as those advantages, increased demands for advocacy, management of funds, dealing with a very opaque system. So none of these things, families, communities, and society, are static either. So they are changing with time, and our research and understandings of the impacts of those things may well differ as time moves along. Okay, so when we're thinking about the impacts that a sibling on siblings, when one member of the siblingship has a disability, we need to be conscious of the fact that sibling relationships and interactions are two-way affairs. It isn't just that the person with Down syndrome is going to have an impact, positive or negative, on the sibling, and neither is it just that the sibling will have an impact on the person with Down syndrome. Both of those things are going to be happening, and there'll be interactions in those things as well. That's really being ignored in the research to this point in time. The research has been very focused on one direction, and that is the impact of having a child with Down syndrome in the family on the sibling. And that's true if you look at any of the disability groups. So if you look at families of children with ASD, that's autism spectrum disorder, that's generally the way it has been. The research is focused on the sibling, the impact on the sibling, and the focus has been narrow. So initially, when people began to pay attention to the sibling, the focus was very much on the negative impact. The assumption was there would be a negative impact on siblings. And so that was the kind of questions that were asked, and that was what was measured. And so data collection was restricted to things such as behavior problems and psychological distress in the sibling. And that may still be the case in some research contexts. So there are still papers, I read one today, in fact, in preparation for this, where the only questions that were asked were about the problems that were experienced by the sibling. However, most of the research has moved now to a wider consideration that includes the benefits of having a brother or a sister with a disability in the sibship. And these studies have generally found that there are positive outcomes. There are warm relationships, generally low levels of conflict, higher levels of empathy, and so on. So what has been neglected, and what I'm going to talk about after I briefly discuss some of this research that has been focused on siblings, is the neglect. What we've neglected is the impact that the child with Down syndrome has on the development of skills and the sort of developmental domains for the sibling. And we've also neglected to ask what's the impact on the person with Down syndrome of the sibling interactions that they have. So as colleagues and I did a scoping review recently where we were able to find only 22 studies that actually looked at the developmental outcomes, the impact of siblings on developmental outcomes for individuals with a disability. Half of them, there were only 22 studies that we found. 2 of them were on families that had a child with Down syndrome. The majority of them were on families that had a child with ASD in them. And as I'll talk later, that's difficult to extrapolate to the findings from those studies, difficult to extrapolate to disabilities of other kinds. So I do find this very hard to understand. And I'm as guilty of this as everybody else, by the way, of neglecting this clearly, potentially, likely, very important influence on development of people with Down syndrome. So let me talk in general about the outcomes for children with disabilities. And they have identified positive outcomes of people, and sibling relationships has been a major focus. And good sibling relationships are found in a number of studies, in most studies that look at sibling relationships of children with disabilities. And when there's an asterisk following something, that means that there has been specific work done with families of children with Down syndrome, and this applies to them. And certainly good sibling relationships, warm relationships, have been found in a number of studies across different countries in families that have a child with Down syndrome. However, a lot of the studies that I'm drawing on for this discussion are quite dated. And if you'll remember, as I was saying, everything changes. And so something that was data that were collected 20 years ago may not be terribly indicative of what's going on now. There's also been the identification of positive personality traits, both by parents of children with Down syndrome and by the young people themselves. So openness to others and so on, acceptance of difference. There is evidence of better understanding of others that comes from being the sibling of a child with Down syndrome and other disabilities. Some studies, not particular to Down syndrome, have found high levels of social cognition and better theory of mind, which is the ability to understand what another person is thinking, to take other people's perspectives about things. And they've also suggested that it's had a positive impact on life skills and on values. There was a recent French study that asked adult siblings about the impact that they saw of having a brother or sister with Down syndrome, and more than 80%, close to 90% of them said that it had a positive impact on their values. There have been some negative, outcomes identified as well, so that there are people that have talked about reduced time for themselves as a sibling and with their parents. Some people feel that they have missed opportunities because of the family's need to provide things, experiences, spend time with the person with disability. There is sometimes reports of anxiety with respect to the brother and sister. Will they be accepted at school? What's going to happen in the future, etc. And in some families, with some disability types, low rates of marriage and childbearing, although that hasn't been identified in studies of children with Down syndrome. So I just need to remind myself that with respect to the good sibling relationships, I did say that had been found in multiple studies across multiple countries, and that's true. But it's not true of all studies in all cultures, so that there are some few studies that have identified difficulties in the sibling relationship. And I expect, although this isn't something that was actually tested within the study, that there may be something to do with cultural values and thoughts about disability, as well as the supports that families have to deal with some of the issues around difficulties with learning language and so on. So the other thing I need to say about this is that, of course, these are all, they're not going to apply to every individual, but there will be some siblings for whom having a brother or a sister with a disability, including having a brother or a sister with Down syndrome, causes them to have negative outcomes. It's something that works poorly for them. We don't know why, and we don't know who that are likely to experience those kinds of things. And I think that's something that we need to be thinking about, because if we don't know those things, then we can't support families in preventing whatever it is that leads to those conflictual and difficult sibling relationships and outcomes. Now, this is an example. You're now seeing my 4 PowerPoint skills here, but let's press on. So I did just want to talk about adulthood briefly, the outcomes for adults. adult siblings. So there are responsibilities of siblings that clearly are related to cultural expectations. So cultures have different expectations about the roles that brothers and sisters will take with respect to their brother or sister with a disability. And for example, I've done some work with a colleague in China where parents were quite adamant that one of their expectations was that the sibling without a disability would take care of the sibling with a disability. And in fact, one parent said quite explicitly, we tell him that's why he was born. That's his job, is to make sure that his brother is looked after in adulthood. Those cultural expectations aren't held as strongly in the West, and so there's more suggestion that families are likely to be suggesting to their siblings that while they want them to be involved, they don't want them to take on full responsibility. And so, but family expectations also differ. So again, some families will have an expectation that the brothers and sisters will have the person with Down syndrome to come and live with them. Others will not have that expectation. But gender is a major impact on this. So it's generally expected that wherever possible, that this will be a female task to take on the responsibility for siblings with disability in adulthood. There are also, of course, personal values. So some individuals will have a clear sense that this is something that they want. They want to take on these responsibilities because that fits with their personal values and how they understand their relationship with their brother or sister. So those also feed into the responsibilities. There are some studies that have looked at influences on sibling involvement in adulthood, and one of those was one that I conducted as a longitudinal study myself. And one of the things that we find is that relationships in adulthood remain good as a general rule, between siblings and the person with Down syndrome, so that they're still quite close. But in typical development, we get a U-shaped curve in terms of closeness with families, between siblings. So as young adults move into other relationships, have children and so on, and enter middle age, the closeness of the sibling relationship reduces somewhat, and then it comes back to being quite close in older adulthood when those responsibilities and time demands are reduced. There's a slight bit of evidence that may be happening too in families of children with adulthood, although I'm extrapolating there because we don't have any longitudinal studies that trace people over a long period of time. As I said, I did one longitudinal study, but it only had 2 time points in it, so that's not anywhere sufficient to track the sibling relationship as it changes over time. But the other thing we found that earlier relationships and behaviour problems in the person with Down syndrome impacted the closeness of relationships in adulthood. And I think that's easy to understand, that if somebody is seen to be more difficult, then the relationship is not likely to be as close, and those early relationships will predict later relationships. All right, now I want to turn to consideration of the impacts that siblings may have on developmental outcomes. So I'm moving kind of beyond relationship issues now. And by developmental outcomes, I mean things like cognitive development and social development in particular. And this is where it all becomes very speculative. So there are different ways in which siblings might impact their brother or sister. One is directly. So the interactions that they have with their brother or sister are going to provide them with direct support or undermining, if you like, of some developmental outcomes. And we know that children are likely to interact more with their siblings than with anybody else in their life, including their parents. And so siblings are a really important source of developmental information and influence. But there's also indirect influences, and indirect influences refer to the way that the children in the family affect others who might affect the siblings. So in particular, how they might affect parenting. So how does having an older child without Down syndrome impact on the way that parents parent a child with Down syndrome? Versus if you have your first child has Down syndrome, how does that impact on the way that you parent your next child in the family? So there are both these direct and indirect influences. And there are two theories, if you like, about, so when people have looked at typically developing children, mostly they've looked at structural issues. And by structural, I mean elements to the way that the family is structured, such as how many children there are in the family, whether a sibling is older or younger than the child who's of interest, whether people are of the same gender or not. So there's been a lot of focus on that kind of structural elements of families. And one of the theories is related to the number of siblings in the family. And the suggestion is that any additional sibling in the family will reduce access to resources. So families will have less money, for example, if they've got 3 children as opposed to 2. Not only will they have less money, but they'll have less time to spend with each sibling. So this is the resource dilution theory, and there is some evidence to support it. But there's also the idea that having more siblings can be a resource. So if parents may not be able to spend as much time talking to the child when there are additional siblings, but the siblings will talk, the siblings will read, etc. So the sibling can be seen to be a resource. And in fact, there's evidence for both of these things. And it depends on, in part, on the area of development that we're considering. So academic performance seems to be impacted by having a large number of children. If you're further down in the system, you're not going to do as well academically on average. But social skills, self-control, etc., seem to be strengthened by having multiple siblings in the family. So complicated. So what might contribute to siblings' influence over each other? So I've listed a whole range of things here. So position and gender are some of those structural things that I was talking about before. In typically developing families, position matters. The older child is generally the leader of the sibship. And so they are often the teacher, etc., of teaching the younger sibling. But this may not work the same way in families where there's a child with Down syndrome. It may be that in some instances, particularly as the children develop, that the younger sibling becomes the leader of the group, of the sibling pair. Gender match can be important, and generally people find that genders that are matched are closer, with female to female matches being the closest of any other of the combinations. The relationship is important. If the relationship is good, it's likely to be influential because that will increase the amount of time that people spend together. So it gives more opportunity for the sibling to be a direct influence on their brother or sister. The social emotional skills of the sibling could be important. So things, for example, such as theory of mind. I spoke before and said theory of mind is about being able to understand somebody else's perspective. And so if a child has good theory of mind skills, then they may be able to assist their brother or sister, a younger brother or sister with Down syndrome, to work through a situation better because they can put themselves in their shoes. There's also a personality, a skill. There's a social emotional skill called cognitive sensitivity, which specifically relates to that capacity to understand the limitations of a partner and to modify one's behavior to address those limitations. And so siblings who've got better cognitive sensitivity are likely to be more influential. Of course, children are going to differ in their personal qualities. Some will be easier to get along with than others. They're more likely to go with the flow, more optimistic and so on, and that's maybe important. The developmental area that's being considered is going to be important because some may be more open to influence than others. So language, for example, may be more open to being influenced by sibling interactions than, for example, numeracy. There are going to be family characteristics that are important. Families differ similarly to individuals in the way that in their values, the ways that they work together, how chaotic they are, etc. So that's going to be important. Behavior problems in the person with disability might have an impact on sibling influence as well, partly through the relationship, but even just through capacity. So if, for example, if child with Down syndrome has sleep problems, then that's likely to impact on the sleep of the sibling, which will potentially impact on their engagement with the brother or sister. And of course, the etiology of the disability might be important as well. There may be some aspects of a disability that make an area of development more difficult to change. And so, for example, with children with autism spectrum disorder, there's a view that they have difficulty with theory of mind. And so that may be something that's not as open to sibling influence as it is in other children. So some of these characteristics are set and some of them are more dynamic and more likely to be able to be managed to be used effectively. So none of these areas really, apart from some of the structural issues, have been looked at really in families of children with Down syndrome. But there is some possibility that siblings of children with Down syndrome may be more influential on the development of their brother or sister than in typically developing children, because of the amount of time that they spend together and because of the reduced opportunities, social opportunities that can sometimes attend having Down syndrome. So if the child with Down syndrome isn't as involved in other activities with classmates, etc., siblings may take on even more importance. So I've identified what I consider to be some roles that might influence development, and one is the teacher role. So these, as I'm going to talk about them, are generally about the sibling influencing the developmental outcomes for the child with Down syndrome. But it may well be sometimes that it goes the other way, that the child with Down syndrome may influence the sibling through some of these roles as well. So, and all of these, the way that these interact will depend on age, developmental stage, level of competence, and so on. So in many cultures, older siblings take on an explicit teaching role. It's generally helpful to do that, but it sometimes can be too directive. And we know that when we look at maternal behavior, if mothers are too directive, that undermines the autonomy of the child with Down syndrome. And so this may also happen if we have siblings who are too directive in their teaching. And there are some indications that there's a danger of this. Unequal interactions have been observed in dyads in which there was a child with Down syndrome and siblings were more directive in their teaching of the child. So we need to be a little careful about this, and I will come back to this right at the end, but we need to be thoughtful about the way that siblings engage in the teacher role, because it might entrench in directiveness or create a view of the child with disability as incompetent, and I think that's something that we need to avoid. The sibling may also be a model or a social reference. So a model is typically used when we're talking about behaviours. Children learn through observation. They observe their siblings in all kinds of situations. They learn a lot of new skills through imitation, and so on. Social reference is sort of a more general term, so that siblings might learn, for example, how to deal with new situations, new people, things that they find frightening through observing their sibling in the way that their sibling interacts and reacts to these things. There's also the role of friend and rival. So this relationship, of course, is important because it will impact on the amount of time that siblings spend together. And so the teaching and modelling roles might depend in part upon the relationship. But it's important to be aware that, of course, even in warm, effective relationships between siblings, there's going to be conflict. Conflict is a normal and usual part of the sibling relationship, and it's not a bad thing. Destructive conflict, which is aggressive and uncompromising, may well be a negative thing, but conflict that can be resolved, where people talk through their issues, can in fact be quite helpful because it teaches a range of skills, including theory of mind, negotiation, compromise, and so on. So friend and rival are likely to coexist in any sibling relationship. And there's also the role of contrast. So one of the developmental tasks that we all have is to create a sense of self, of who we are. And that process is called de-identification, and children do this. They differentiate themselves from their brothers and sisters. They create a particular niche within the family for themselves. And this is particularly relevant for children who have older siblings. They have to make their mark by being different, generally, from the brother or sister. So there have been a number of studies that have looked at this in children with Down syndrome and found that they do, in fact, compare themselves to their brother or sister. And Sheila Glenn and Cliff Cunningham, quite a number of years ago now, did an interview study with people with Down syndrome, young people with Down syndrome, and found that they did compare themselves to their brother or sister. And actually, most of them wanted to be similar to their brother or sister rather than being particularly different. So there are other sibling roles that are not so much related to developmental outcomes, but I thought are probably worth just mentioning. And there are some that are more likely to belong to the sibling and some that apply to both siblings. So these, those that apply primarily to the sibling role are those of protector, advocate, and carer. So they're not only adult roles, of course, they do occur in childhood, and Brian Skotko in some of his work identified siblings taking on the role, seeing themselves as having the role of protector of their brother or sister within the school. And but as siblings get older and take on more responsibilities, they may well take on these roles in a more identified way. So they may be an advocate for their brother or sister with the systems outside the family, but they may also advocate for their adult sibling within the family if that brother or sister with Down syndrome has aspirations that differ from those that parents hold, as an example. And they may also take on the role of carer, providing physical support and so on. The carer role, though, in particular, I think is one that doesn't just belong to the person who does not have Down syndrome, but it's an area of family life that we've kind of neglected, I think, as a role for people with disabilities. But often they may fill that role within a family as parents in particular get older. There are also related to that the role of supporter, so providing instrumental, that is practical support and effective support, and this may both siblings may engage in this. So instrumental support, for example, might be providing money, but it also could be providing services such as babysitting, etc. And affective support is being there emotionally available to the sibling so that concerns and joys and so on can be shared. And brothers, adults in a particular study identified their role in adulthood very strongly as that of friend for their brother or sister with Down syndrome. So, future research. The first thing I would say is, please, let's do it. Let's fix this gaping hole in our understanding of the influences on individuals with Down syndrome, and looking also at the influences on the developmental outcomes for the siblings. So, for example, being the sibling, for example, taking a teacher role with a child with Down syndrome growing up may well advance some of the cognitive skills of the sibling. We've, as I said at the beginning of this talk, it's a puzzle to me that we have overlooked this potential source of enormous influence for so long. So it's time to address that. And to do that, we need families to participate. So this isn't just a job for researchers. The researchers can do all the great thinking that they are capable of to develop good, robust research. But if we don't have families who are willing to participate in that, then we're not going to get very far. So I think we need to investigate both directions of influence. It's insufficient to be, as we've done in the past, primarily looking at the impact of having a brother or sister with Down syndrome on siblings. We need to think about what are the influences on, what are the impacts on people with Down syndrome of having brothers and sisters. We need to consider both positive and negative outcomes. We need to be open to the fact that both of these might occur, and in the case of these, why they occur. So if we identify a group of people for whom there are negative outcomes, we need to be asking the question, why? What is it that's going on here that's doing these, having these outcomes? We need to identify those domains of development that are open to sibling influence. So not all of them are necessarily going to be as open, and we need to know what they are. And we need to try and understand the processes of influence. So looking at structural elements of the relationship is not very useful unless it helps us to theorize why we may be getting that impact. So for example, if we find that having an older sibling is good for language development, we can't ask parents to go and produce an older sibling. Too late for that. But we can think about what is it that an older sibling then provides in the environment, which is probably an enriched language environment. So we can then take that idea and test out whether or not it's likely to have some legs. So there are challenges if we're going to be conducting this kinds of research, of course. One is the low incidence of Down syndrome, and many of you will be aware that in Western countries in particular, there are reducing numbers of children with Down syndrome being born. There's enormous variability across people with Down syndrome that might impact development. So things like sensory impairments, ASD is becoming an increasing issue in the Down syndrome population. So we need to take account of that. And already, we've got a small group, and then we've got smaller groups as well. Once we start to think about these additional aspects of development that might impact on the developmental trajectories of and all of those capacities to influence. So Down syndrome occurs across all SES levels, but it's difficult to get families from low SES backgrounds into research, and it's difficult to retain them in research. So in some of the research, the longitudinal research that I've been involved with, the groups that we've lost are those generally who have lower socioeconomic background, and we need to find ways to retain them. There may well be a disinclination of families to participate in research when sibling relationships are negative, so we need to be thinking about how to deal with that. The systemic nature of families, if you refer back to the earlier slide where I talked about the range of subsystems and the changes within that, of course, are going to make things complicated. But we need to try and find ways to address it. And of course, the difficulty of capturing indirect influences is also going to be a challenge, I think. So in conclusion, development is a complex thing with multiple influences, but an important one is likely to be the siblings. Families are complex. They vary in their nature, they vary in their expectations, they vary in their composition. So we need to be able to find a way to deal with that complexity. We need to undertake robust longitudinal research if we're going to get a good handle on these complexities and to understand the ways in which sibling behaviors, interactions, characteristics influence the outcomes for the person with Down syndrome and vice versa. We need to keep culture front of mind. We can't pretend that work that's done in the USA or in Australia is going to apply in India or China. And so we need to be trying to understand how to do that kind of research and how to make research more usable across a wider group of people. In my view, relationships are likely to provide the crucible for influence. So while most of the research is focused on relationships, and I'd like us to move beyond that, it's not that I don't think they're important. I think they are really important because that's where the influence is going to be situated, because that's where the interaction is going to occur. And finally, I just want to add a cautionary note. We need to be very careful, I think, about the way that we think about siblings and the influence on developmental outcomes. I would be very anxious about us moving from this idea to the idea that siblings are change agents for people with Down syndrome. If we're going to investigate that idea, we have to be really confident that we're not changing the relationship in a way that is not useful. So, for example, we're not putting the idea that the person with Down syndrome is not competent, we're not entrenching directiveness and so on. So we need to tread cautiously, and I think that any research that is focused on using siblings as agents of change need to make sure that they are investigating that that wider sense of what's happening in the relationship if we do this, rather than just looking for the change in the skills of the person with Down syndrome. Thank you very much for listening.